Welcome to Getting APIs to Work. And today we say hello to Samir Amzani. Samir, thanks for being on the show. How are you doing?
I'm good, Eric. Thanks for having me.
I got in touch with you because you did work for Adidas, and I thought your experience with Adidas and with API governance within Adidas was pretty unique, was pretty special and very interesting. So I asked you whether you would be willing to talk with me a little bit about how you did governance at Adidas. And in full disclosure, when I asked you, you were still at Adidas, but now you're not there anymore. But that's
I'm still a big fan.
Yes, you're still a big fan, and I think most people are. Thanks for being on the show. And I'm really curious if we just jump right in terms of what API governance is. If somebody asks you, what is API governance? How would you define it? What's your definition?
Well, API governance first for me is like mindset, and it centralized really on who is making the decision and how, really. This is for me the API governance. And speaking in the context of Adidas, well, when we brought the API program, and the first thing we start is really to spread that mindset across Adidas teams. And one of the key selling point of this mindset is fixing what I can call the integration spaghetti mess, when you have a lot of mini interfaces, like thousands of interfaces that really results in a poor design and low quality APIs. So the API governance really focus was to establish that guidelines and enable teams to decide how to build and consume APIs in an efficient way. So for Adidas, I would say the first task was to really define this style guides and enable them across different teams.
But the way you explained it, actually, the style guide almost is the second thing, right? The first thing that you said was really just convincing people why APIs matter and why it's important that they care, right? And I think that alone is something that in some organizations, that step almost is missing. And I think it's really important, the way you pointed it out, that if people don't understand what APIs are for, they have a hard time caring.
Exactly.
So I think that's really important.
Exactly.
And then the guidelines, I like the way that, you kind of started with, well, why do they even matter, right? But then, of course, now that people are on board, then the guidelines basically tell them, okay, and now how do we actually do this? So how did you approach setting those guidelines? Or I don't like setting so much because that is always like this top-down mentality, right? So how did you approach creating those guidelines?
Well, when I joined Adidas, the foundation of the guidelines were already there. So I was quite a bit lucky. But I was hired to do the hard part, as an API evangelist, is how you should enable these guidelines across Adidas teams. And this was challenging because in addition to have this idealistic vision, of how APIs should look like, you need to understand and to be the helping hands for the guys that create those APIs. So you can feel the pain. So this for me is really the most important part. So you need to be like inside with the guys that are building those APIs. So I would say they were kind of idealistic, but decentrally challenged by Adidas teams. And of course, they need to feel and own that guidelines in order to adopt them. Otherwise, it will not work.
The word pain is, I think, really important here because it shows that empathy is necessary, right? You need to empathize with developers. Now, even if they have bought into your mindset, now, what is holding them back, right? What makes their lives hard? So when you started trying to find the pain points, what were like some of the typical pain points that you discovered where you realized that, oh, maybe we should improve that so that it becomes less painful?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we focus on the pain, and for us, we are really like pinpointing what are the common problems that engineers have when they work with APIs. So it can be in terms of design, it can be in terms of how these APIs should be exposed, how they should be tested. So we established kind of an API framework or an API lifecycle with different stages, and for each stage we defined, okay, for instance, you want to design the APIs, what should you do, right? And yeah, one typical problem, like how you can manage errors. So this is like everyone like have errors in the APIs, and this is the most obvious one. But if you don't do it right, you can end up like of having different problems at different levels. So really designed proper errors can matter for operational like point of view. It can matter for the support. And we have a specification for that. And the challenge actually was like really to adopt that specification and to present it in a, let's say, in a nice way, or like really focusing on the problem with some examples. And this was, for me, was like the not the hardest part, but the fun part, because you need to really understand the business problem and saying, guys, we can do that in a better way.
Mm-hmm. And I think in the end also, actually, that's an interesting question I would like to ask you. So on the one hand, right, there's the pain of the people developing APIs. And I think that it's really important that you start looking at that and trying to minimize that pain. On the other hand, there also is the pain of people consuming APIs. So I'm wondering, like, how did you focus on that? Or how did that pain of the API consumer, how did that enter your equation?
Yeah, well, for the API consumer, I would say it's the even the most interesting persona when it comes to APIs, because we need to consider them on the design phase as much as possible, and we need to consider them in every single step in the API journey, of course. But taking care of designing those APIs with the customers make a lot of sense, and this is what we did. So, for instance, when we had like design sessions, with the API providers, so we this is one part also of what we were doing at Adidas in the API platform. We cannot like do a meeting or a design workshop without API customers. So really, it's a mindset shift, and instead of really focusing on the technology, for instance, and having just some data somewhere to expose, okay, and we are done, we have an API. This is wrong. This cannot scale. And you need first to consider that customer and to build that API for the customer use case. Otherwise, you will just realize that you are spending a lot of time developing an API that the consumer don't need in the end, right? So we really need to focus on that. Like this API is meeting the business need, and the consumer is involved in every and single phase on the API journey.
So there's a lot of product thinking involved there, which I think is really important.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we were also proud of is we enabled the API product ownership. So our product owner shifted from like traditional, let's say, product owner to also managing APIs as a product. So they were quite familiar with all of these things.
Yeah, that sounds like a really important step to me. It's like ownership, because it's really hard to transition to a product-oriented view of APIs when nobody owns them, right? Nobody's responsible. Nobody feels like, well, I should make this the best possible product I can, and then they're just sitting there, and nobody's responsible, right? Yeah. So the next question, I think, is also interesting for many, looking at a little bit of advice, which is like, how do you now start convincing teams to actually following those guidelines, right? Or taking them into account, whatever you would call that, right? But like not just having those guidelines, but also making sure that these are the guidelines that are practiced within your development teams.
Yeah, actually, there are different parts on that one. But the most important one is you need to give the tooling, the right tooling in order to adopt those guidelines. So otherwise, you will just end up in some best practices written somewhere. You need to provide that tooling, and you make that hard thing. So API design is hard. You need to make it easy, and then let the engineers just focus on the business problems. So, for instance, like how we ensure that an API is compliant with the guidelines. So we have different toolings today, so you can have a kind of LinkedIn to ensure that your style guide is codified. So it's not just some best practices written somewhere. So you can have this kind of stuff, and the engineers can just, without like spending a lot of effort, have this short feedback loop. You know? And this is what we've been focusing on. But of course, you have different like parts, like how to expose the APIs. So I would say it's even the most challenging part, because we needed to be challenged on. I mean, to be challenged on the technology as well. Because thinking of like traditional way of doing API management doesn't scale anymore. So, for instance, we moved from a traditional API gateway tool to an ingress-based API gateway to enable engineers to expose their endpoint the same way they deploy like a microservice, for instance, in Kubernetes. So we enabled this GitOps way of exposing APIs. And yeah, this was the most challenging part.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like it. On the other hand, I really like the way how you said that what you have to do is basically sell the guidelines, so to speak, and like this very basic idea of what's in it for me, right? For a developer, if a developer sees, well, you know, if I use this, then things are faster, easier, I can get stuff done quicker, right? I think they're easy to convince, so to speak, or easier. So yeah, I think you had a pretty good kind of storyline there, you know, saying of, yeah, first, you know, the mindset and the guidelines, then you need to start thinking about how to people actually convince that the guidelines make sense and to help them with tooling. And it seems that this worked pretty well. You've been at Adidas for three and a half years, right?
Yeah.
And how would you, like, if you could paint a picture of how the API culture, so to speak, changed within those 3.5 years, how would you characterize that change that happened?
That's an interesting one. So when I joined, it was like really the starting of the API program. You know, it was like more on the evangelist part, like how, like explaining the why of the API. You know, why it makes sense to have reusable APIs instead of having 10,000 interfaces, and yeah, really understanding also what is the business value of APIs. You know, having few APIs to manage is not like having thousands of interfaces. So at that time, it was kind of really having the awareness, you know, developing that awareness.
Yeah.
So from management point of view, it was a kind of centrally managed, you know, like even we acquired, not acquired, but we used an API management tool that was like really central, and because it was easy, you know, it's the beginning, and we wanted to move fast. It's also to show the value of that management stuff, and then we see the landscape also moving to microservices, moving to the cloud. So of course, this is what I said earlier, like we needed to challenge ourselves how we do API management. So API management is not just one single tool, you know. You need to challenge yourself and see what is there from technology point of view. And this is what we did. So for the API runtime, this is, by the way, the most challenging part of the API management, because API design, we almost have nice tooling. So we achieved at least having all the APIs in one single place. So this was one of the biggest achievement, actually, to have this 400 APIs in our designer repository. And then when we see everyone moving to microservices, complaining about this traditional way of managing APIs because they need velocity, they need speed. So you need to provide other things, right? So then we move to the ingress approach, where everyone can just expose their APIs in their data plane. And then you have another challenge, which is how to ensure those APIs are compliant with the guidelines, you know? So thankfully, the solution that we adopted in Kubernetes have this mechanism of control plan. So you can codify your security rules or validation rules in terms of API exposure. And actually we really moved from this traditional way of doing API management to, I would say, decentralized, moving to the cloud as well, which really triggered that movement. And in the end, we needed to make everything easy, like in terms of API checks. So I don't need to spend a lot of time having this feedback for my API development, right? So yeah, that was it.
Yeah, that's. I think it's a good story to also say, you know, the way that you started, like these 3.5 years ago, right, is not where you are now, which I think is really, it's a good story that people should hear. It's that, you know, you have to adapt your API governance and your API management to, well, your evolving API landscape, right? And it seems that you did make quite a number of changes there, which is, I think, a really good pattern to happen, that, you know, you adapt to what's happening. Now, one last thing I would like to hear from you is, do you have any kind of central takeaways from your time at Adidas? You're now entering a new job, and I hope we'll talk about this also in another episode, but your time at Adidas is over. So I'm just wondering, any takeaways that you would like to share with us?
Well, there are many takeaways. I would say the most important one is API management is not about technology. So for me, it's really about people, because technology is, almost, we have many solutions, many options to do the API in the right way. We have different API styles today. So it's not about REST, GraphQL, Kafka, whatever, because in the end, the customer, the business don't care about these protocols, right? But they care about getting the business right and solving the problem. So I would say, it's about really people understanding the pain point and also be the helping hands. So focus on the pain and try to understand how to get the API value as much as possible.
Thank you so much for saying that. I love when you ask somebody about his takeaways from a very API-centric job, and what they say it's not about technology.
Exactly.
No, that's pretty cool. And I think you're totally right? In the end, if you use APIs at the, so to speak, the right level, right, they're all about connecting different teams, making things available across teams, and making that in ways that are easy, convenient, not painful, and so forth. So it's all about understanding how you can actually make those teams work together. So really like that. Samir, thank you so much for joining. Like I said in the beginning, I hope this is not the last time you're here. So you're in a new job now, so we can talk about this another time. But thanks so much for being on the show today. I hope that everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. and I'll let you go for today. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Bye.
Bye.